students. Today we're going to be looking at the terrestrial biomes, the biomes on land, and we're going to be classifying them based on how much water they have and how warm they are. And so it's a good idea to kind of keep those two measures in mind as we look through the terrestrial biomes. So each of the terrestrial biomes has specific recognizable features, things like the tropical rainforest having a large amount of diversity, or deserts having sparse vegetation. These are things that we can kind of count on. And we find that different biomes are not just in different regions or continents, but we tend to see them consistently along latitudinal planes. So latitude, remember longitude are the long lines, and latitude is like ladder steps. So if you were going to climb the earth from the South Pole to the North Pole, you would climb up the latitude. What we see on our earth, and so just look with me down here at the globe, we have these latitudinal planes, and so whether you are in North America or you're in Asia, you're going to have on this latitudinal plane northern coniferous forest. And as you go below that, you're going to have a mixture of temperate broadleaf forests, which are the darker green colors. And then you're going to have the temperate grasslands, which are more of the tan coloration. You're going to have the chaparral, which we see in Southern California, but also in Northern Africa. So depending on what latitude you're on, you can start to predict the different biomes that you might see. And that explains in a lot of ways why you might see very similar plants and animals in the main part of Africa and the central part of South America. So we can kind of predict the animals that we'll see, and we can see this consistency throughout the globe. Most of the time when we look at a biome, it's going to give us a readout of the temperature in Celsius. So Celsius is what the whole world uses to measure temperature. It's not what we in the United States use to measure temperature, but 0 is freezing in Celsius, where 32 is freezing in Fahrenheit. As we look, what we're going to see is that, for example, the tropical forests are going to be up here in this higher region of temperature, but also in the higher region of annual precipitation, where a desert is going to be in the high to mid temperature range, but on the very lowest amount of precipitation. So one metric alone, just temperature or just rainfall, can't necessarily indicate what kind of a place you're in. For example, the northern coniferous forest over here might get 250 centimeters of annual rainfall, and so does the tropical forest, but it just depends on the overall temperature, how we might classify it. So you have to look at both metrics, both the temperature and the rainfall. So we'll be looking at those as we go through the biomes. What we're going to do now is just take a quick look at some of the main biomes that we see and start to get an idea of the biotic, the living, and the abiotic, non-living factors that we see in each of those biomes. So starting out with the tropical rainforest, this is mostly at or just below the equator. As we look back, the tropical rainforest is this bright green coloration that we see through India and through parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. What we can expect in the tropical rainforest is consistent rainfall, nearly 12-hour days year-round. That's because it's so close to the equator. Not a lot of seasonality, again, because it's so close to the equator. There are tropical dry forests. Tropical rainforest just means that we have consistent rainfall all year long, where a tropical dry forest would have a wet season and a drier season. But what we can tell about a rainforest altogether is that they're going to have these areas of growth. There is the floor down here where we see lots of decomposers. And then we have the understory where the animals that walk on land might live. We have the canopy near kind of the tops of the trees where you'd expect to see monkeys and birds. And then we have the emergent where there's just like a tree sticking out and what vegetation might live on that kind of tree island, if you want to think about it like that, that new growth that's sticking out. And there are different flora and fauna, different interactions, different species found in each of these levels. And so the rainforest is a really interesting thing to study because even within it, there are so many different kind of ecological niches. The second biome we want to talk about is the chaparral. The chaparral is what we live in. The chaparral is mid-latitude coastal regions, mild, rainy winters, hot, dry summers. This is us. Short, fire tolerant, kind of brushy vegetation. Some of the seeds that live in the chaparral will not germinate unless there is a fire that comes through. They won't grow. This is something that, for example, Torrey pines, the Torrey pines trees, which are in San Diego, there are a number of preserves in La Jolla for those Torrey pine trees. And one of the things that the stewards of those preserves need to think about is in order to preserve the trees, they actually need to allow some fires to come through, because without any fire, you won't get the germination of the pine tree and you won't get the new growth. So even though we technically think of fire as being destructive, because it is a part of the ecosystem of the chaparral, the animals and the plants that are native to this area are actually meant to withstand fire without much trouble. The people that have problems with the fire are us, right? Not necessarily the vegetation. And if you let things go too long and a fire comes through, then the fire might get too hot, and that actually starts to cause a problem. So regular controlled burns are an important thing to consider in the chaparral. So as we move away from the equator, we start to see the desert and the savanna. The desert has low, unpredictable rainfall. It's mostly sandy and dry with scattered vegetation and a lot of drought-tolerant plants, those CAM and C4 plants that are succulents. Reptiles and birds, which are also more drought tolerant, they're adapted to getting their water when they break down carbohydrates in the food that they eat. So they actually get their water from their food, many of them. Some also have particular scale setups so that they're able to collect the dew on their scales and turn it into usable drinking water. If you live in the desert, there have to be lots of adaptations. The deserts can be really hot. They can also be very cold. The big thing about the desert is because it's so dry, there are big fluctuations in temperature between daytime and nighttime temperatures and between the different seasons. The savanna is a grassland with very warm temperatures. When you picture the Lion King, you're picturing a savanna, giraffes walking through, the herds of wildebeests all moving around. They have more water than a desert. They have more seasonal variation than a rainforest, but they're kind of in that same equatorial area. They tend to have a very long dry season, and the dry season is really treacherous for animals. If you've ever watched like an Animal Planet kind of show, they're always waiting for the wet season. They're waiting out for the rain as the watering holes get smaller and smaller. And watering holes are like a real thing in the savanna, where a lot of animals kind of come to the watering hole to get some water, because there is water available, but it is more scarce. There are lots of large migratory animals here because of the huge amount of seasonality, the big difference between the wet season and the dry season. Some animals have to leave entirely or move to a new location for portions of the year. And then, of course, their predators follow them. And so there's a lot of migration. The last two biomes that we're going to look at are the tundra. The tundra looks at all the areas of the Arctic. This is very cold. You can almost think of it like a very, very cold desert. There's very little rainfall. It's cold year round, high winds, low temperatures. And up in the tundra, there's a very short growing season. There's something called permafrost in the tundra, which means that the lowest layers of the earth, of the soil, never thaw. So plants that grow, like these lichen that reindeer eat, all of these lichen that are growing here, all of these little shrubs and plants and algal symbionts, are growing with very shallow roots and very, very quickly for a very short growing season. And then the cold comes back in, and that's that. They have short days most of the year, really a treacherous place to live. And so, because of that, like with the deserts, we see much less vegetation in the tundra. The northern coniferous forest is sometimes called the taiga, and summers here are warm, but winters are cold. And so this is like, it's not alpine because alpine is because you've gone up in elevation. That doesn't necessarily have to do with your biome. But a northern coniferous forest is like the Canadian forest that you're thinking of, the forests of the northern part of the United States or the northern part of Europe. And so what we're seeing here are conifers, lakes, and sandy beaches. This is where we would see lots of moose or brown bear if you've been to Yellowstone, Montana. This is the kind of coniferous forest that we're seeing there. Coniferous just means that we have cone-bearing plants as opposed to broadleaf forests where you would tend to see more maple trees. So a maple tree has the kind of leaf that you might do like a rubbing, right? Like you might collect them and press them into a book or something. They change colors seasonally. Coniferous plants tend to have needles instead of broad leaves. And so that's something you might want to be keeping track of. Moose, brown bear, migratory birds, eagles. This is a really kind of familiar forest for us growing up in this area. These are going to have a little different names for each of these biomes. And so I know your book uses some different terms like they call the chaparral, the temperate woodland. Don't be overly concerned with those discrepancies. It's fine, especially in your evolution deep dive slides that you're doing. Just you can call it, I know the names, it's okay. You can call it what's familiar. And on the test, of course, I'm going to use the terms that are in your textbook. Okay, I'm going to stick with those terms. All right, you guys, I will see you tomorrow for a little more on population biology.